You're listening to Sonica on Wholehearted Men.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Wholehearted Men Show with your host, Sonica. Every day in the news, we stand witness to examples of a world in which more and more men are showing up broken, misdirected, aggressive, violent, emotionally and mentally unstable. There's a visible lack of emotional intelligence evident in male culture that needs education and rehabilitation. We need to teach men how to love. On the Wholehearted Men Show, we explore how to help men live life with heart. The Wholehearted Men Show is sponsored by the Institute for Wholehearted Men, whose primary goal is to nurture the emotional and mental health of men so they can engage with the world wholeheartedly. Join us as we take this journey to change the hearts of men, one conversation at a time.
The Wholehearted Men Show. 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 The Wholehearted Men Show.
Tom Weiner taught 3rd to 6th grade at the Smith College Campus School for 40 years before retiring in 2015. He continues to supervise student teachers, offers workshops in developing healthy boys, and is an anti-racism activist. He is the author of 3 books called To Serve, Stories of Men and Women Confronted by the Vietnam War, Photographed Letters on Wings, How Microfilmed V-Mail Helped Win World War II, and Chosen Family, Men's and Women's Support Groups, An Inside Look. He and Dr. Amilcar Shabazz, African-American Studies professor at the University of Massachusetts, are currently involved in a book project titled In Defiance, Little-Known Seekers of Racial Justice and Equity Since the Dawn of Enslavement. Thank you to all our viewers and listeners for joining us today on the Wholehearted Men Show. And hang tight as we speak with Tom about his work with conscious masculinity, anti-racism, and growing healthy boys. Show with your host, Sonica Kamahuza. And today we're talking with Thomas Weiner, who is somebody that I met through Connecticut Men's Gathering and also a race dialogue that has been going on for about 5 years. You can grab that or click
it's
on
grabbed.
it, no problem.
It's grabbed.
But has been doing a lot of work in the community in terms of dialoguing about men and also just dialoguing about race. So as we continue this dialogue about race relations, equity, so on and so forth, I thought that it'd be great to bring Thomas on here to share a little bit about the work that he's been doing and also his view on equity, right? Equity and race and men and developing men and really creating this emotional capital in men. So welcome, Tom, and please go ahead and give us a little rundown, even though we've had it in your bio, about you and why you are here doing this work.
Well, first of all, I want to just clarify, I am not part of Comega, even though I admire it and I appreciate it. And I got to know about it through Michael Chell, who you've had on here, who also was the one who got me involved in the cross-race dialogue group where I met you.
Wow, great. Okay.
So
Great clarification, but you're a Comega-hearted man, so
yes,
I'll take that on that.
My spirit is with Comega, and if I were to participate in it, I know it would speak to me and vice versa.
Right.
And in fact, one of the reasons I've not joined is because my center has been in Western Massachusetts.
Okay.
I live in Northampton, where I've been for over 40 years. And all of the men's work I've done and the heart work I've done has taken place within probably 10 miles of my home.
Very good. So you're doing community work. You're trying to change
very much so. Very much
community. So that's
of
even a
levels.
very, very poignant point, right?
Yeah, I would say that it doesn't just focus in even on the conscious masculinity work. It's
Right.
very much as where I met you as anti-racism work, which certainly is all about dismantling white male patriarchy and supremacy, but it really does move into issues of gender, sexual orientation. These are all areas, and actually, I would say that my career is where I was able to express this most poignantly for myself as a teacher of 11 and 12-year-olds for most of my 40-year career, as well as in the summers working at Upward Bound at the University of Connecticut in stores with inner city high school students from Hartford, New Haven, Willimantic. So there's been a number of arenas in which my activism is played out beyond conscious masculinity, which is certainly one of the main focal points, especially now in my retirement, where I've written a book on men's and women's support groups because I've been in a support group, one or another, since the early 70s, and also the work I've done in the last 3 years with workshops on developing healthy boys for early childhood educators. So those are definitely centerpieces of my last several years and beyond.
So why the interest? Well, how did you even like?
Oh, that's good.
Why? How did you even end up here? I mean, this is all very poignant, all very salient. Maybe is the word I'm looking for. Salient things, but the question is, how do you even like land? On that.
That's great.
How do you even land on that?
Well, I in the most recent book I had published called Chosen Family, Men's and Women's Support Groups, An Inside Look, I chose to write about my own journey in the preface. And my journey really towards this work, or encompassing this work, starts in the late 60s when I was at Trinity College in Hartford and became an anti-racism activist in the civil rights movement and an anti-war activist in the opposition to the Vietnam War.
So you started young.
I was, I would say 1969 was the pivotal year for me. I was 19 that year. And those two movements made enormous sense to me. That summer, the summer of 69, I had spent in an urban renewal agency in White Plains, New York, and found out upon arrival that I was going to be responsible for getting housing for over 100 families in the course of my 8-week tenure. And I was overwhelmed. And these were all impoverished or working class families. And they were being forced to leave by what was also called at the time Negro removal.
What does that mean? What did that mean?
That meant that these people had to leave their homes so that the central inner city part of White Plains was going to be redeveloped. And quite a few new parking lots, shopping, not housing, not affordable housing. Some housing projects were made available, but only if you qualified, meaning that you had to have all your ducks in a row. Many of these families didn't have their ducks in a row. And that summer, I started hanging out with the kids so that the families would let me in the door, because they didn't want to know from urban renewal. They were content to pretend it wasn't there because it was only bad news. And I started hanging out with the kids, played with them, basketball with them at the playgrounds. And then I'd walk home with them, and then the families would let me in because I needed to help them. I needed to try to see if they would let me help.
If my history serves me correctly, this is around about the time they were building what we now term the ghettos in New York, right?
Yeah, they were building them earlier. These were like the next stage.
The next stage of it, right?
Because they were trying to knock some of those down so they could build more like what we now see in a lot of central cities, which is gentrification. Right. We see housing for the affluent, and we also see high-end shops. These people were removed. That was the reason they called it Negro removal, because that was what it was doing.
Right.
And when I got back to Trinity after my 8 weeks of amazing experiences of getting some people into housing and feeling tremendously frustrated when other people were unable to qualify, I got back to Trinity and I was missing these kids that had been a centerpiece of the summer. And I reached out to a man in the North End named Ned Cole, who had an organization called the Revitalization Corps. And I asked him if he could help me get to be with some children. And he said, you don't have to bother coming to the North End. There's a real ghetto in the South End, and I can give you the names of a bunch of kids. And I'll give you a 1953 Chevy school bus, and you figure out what you want to do with them. So that was really the start of my deeper dive into activism. That was the fall of 70. 70. And actually 69, sorry. So that was the summer, and this was the fall when I got back to school. And I got deeply involved with numerous families and students. We forged a group called the Odd Squad, named after the Mod Squad TV show. And because every other Sunday, the Odd Sunday, we would go on field trips. And I started an art center, and I did tutoring, and then got 30 people from Trinity to join us, college students. And I assigned students in the inner city to them, and we went on field trips. We did art stuff. They tutored them. I brought them up to the campus. And that was really the immersion. In fact, it was actually difficult to also keep working on anti-war stuff, because I was being a student and I was running a program. So that was really where that part of my activism started. But I would say the conscious masculinity part really stemmed from my first marriage. The woman I met on a bus coming up from New York with her 2-year-old daughter, who I got involved with, she was a staunch feminist. And I had not really been around staunch feminists yet. This was 1972. And she was not accepting bullshit. She really needed to know that I was going to get with the program of being a feminist man.
Right.
And when I thought about the work I'd been doing in the civil rights movement and the work I did at college at Trinity to forge this program, it all made sense. How could I not be thinking women deserved to be treated with great respect, esteem, honoring, empathy, compassion, wholeheartedness, after I'd seen the value of doing that for African American people? So I embraced her program. I got with the program, and there was an extra added piece, a 2-year-old child. And she was incredibly insistent. And if I was going to be involved in her little family, I had to be involved. I had to be taking equal responsibility for raising this child as our relationship solidified. And that morphed into a second child. And I took a year off from teaching to be with that child full time, while I was further and deepening my commitment to conscious masculinity by joining my first men's group in 73.
Wow.
So these things go deep into the roots of me.
Yeah, and that's why I want to ask, probably because it sounds to me as if at a very young age, right, you were already at a level of consciousness which was not consistent. I know there was the anti-war movement back in the day when the Vietnam War. I know about the feminist movement, Gloria Steinem, that during that age. But to be a male white man, Caucasian man, who consciously, it sounds very much as if you were consciously making decisions to engage in the Black story, right?
Absolutely.
The female story, right? And like you said,
very much so,
the male consciousness at a time when it probably wasn't nouveau. It probably wasn't, for lack of a better word, something that was going to get you any points anywhere,
Well, I would qualify that a little bit by saying that, and I pay tribute. The first chapter of my book is the tribute to the women's movement, especially with consciousness raising groups that they started in the mid 60s. I pay homage to them, because they were starting to seep into male consciousness at the same time I was getting it in the early 70s. That's how come I could join a men's group. I was not feeling entirely alone. There were several other men with whom I forged a group in 1973. All three of them were 10 years older than me and going through divorces because their partners were saying, I'm not putting up with this as feminist women. But it's also worth pointing out that when I started saying things to my family, like I'm taking a year off to raise my children, especially my new son, it was seriously frowned upon.
Yeah, that must have seemed just absolutely like off the off the range.
Yeah, it was not in the realm of their awareness to do that without giving up too much. And the same thing was true, though, in between the end of college in 71, when I got drafted and found a way to get out of the draft and have written a book about that called Call to Serve, Stories of Men and Women Confronted by the Vietnam War Draft, that was adapted into a play called The Draft that had its premiere in Boston in 2015 and was chosen as the best ensemble cast and deals with issues of masculinity for sure. But the point being that when I was in between college and that pivotal moment that I point to where I met Eliza on that bus on that fateful ride from New York to Amherst with her 2-year-old daughter, it's worth pointing out that I went for a year. I got a fellowship to study in England and the continent and Israel and Northern Europe alternative education from the Watson Foundation. And I chose to live in Brixton. Are you familiar with Brixton?
Okay. Yeah, I'm familiar.
And I got the same kind of resistance from my white English family that I got from my own parents 5 years later when I told them, I'm going to be taking a year off to raise my son. So these were things that were not in the mainstream culture, that were considered almost aberrations or at least mistakes, and that I had to feel fortified enough and find enough supports to undertake.
And you managed to exit Brixton without a Jamaican accent, basically.
I wish I had a Jamaican accent. I really wish I was able to better understand Jamaican accents, because I just finished watching all 5 episodes of Steve McQueen's Small Axe.
There you go.
The first of which was set 3 years before me in '68. Right. And I missed too much of the dialogue because I didn't master Jamaican.
All right. I think what makes this interesting is the chronology, because you definitely are one of the few men that I have had on the show who has clearly had a historical perspective of already doing the work. You know, this is not like a Johnny come lately kind of situation for you.
Yeah, I hope it's not because I'm as old as I am.
Right. You've been, and by the way, you can date yourself. I know that because when you talk about 69, I was 2, right?
I get it. I got it.
And you are already talking about being consciously in a place where you were saying something's wrong, right?
Many things were wrong in many realms.
Exactly. And
they still are.
And there were a lot of people doing that. And I think that we take that for granted. We take for granted, and I share that even with the civil rights movement, that I always tell people of color that it's not only people of color who are fighting for civil rights. You know, if you look at the march, the Montgomery March, you know, and you look at the pictures, there were lots of Caucasian people in that crowd who were being beaten at the same time, you know, holding hands and arm in arm with people of color. And, you know, Mississippi, when those kids from, you know, those college kids got killed, there were 2 Caucasian that got killed, and, you know, them sending Scarpa down there to get the info was him actually infiltrating and beating, you know, Ku Klux Klan members so that he could get information. So
you're actually making an incredible bridge to my current project, so I'm going to plug it. I'm working on a book right now that takes what you just described in the 60s and drops it back about 150 to 200 years.
Wow. Give me an explanation. What does that mean?
The book the title comes from a quote I read in a book called Learning from the Germans Race and the Memory of Evil. And the quote was from Brian Stevenson, who's the man who's created the Equal Justice Initiative,
Yes.
Just Mercy Book and Film.
Racial Equity Institute. Very good.
And he has a quote in which he says in this book, yes, it's okay, tear down those Confederate statues, but what you should build in their place are tributes to the people, black and white, who in defiance of what was going on, did what was right. And the new book is called In Defiance, Little Known Seekers of Racial Justice and Equality Since the Dawn of Enslavement. We have, and I'm writing it with an African-American studies professor from University of Massachusetts named Dr. Amilcar Shabazz. And we're writing about 10 black people, 10 white people you've never heard of. That have never been given. I mean, I'm assuming you may have heard of at best one or two of them, but they all are giants whose shoulders we stand on and who risk their lives constantly to fight for justice and equality for African Americans, starting in 1688.
Right.
And it's a labor of love, as have the other books been, but this one is really, it's been in the making for decades, because when I would teach sixth grade, I had a unit called African American Contributors to American Culture. And where were the resources? Where was I going to find stuff back in 1982 about renowned African Americans who were not being celebrated unless they were in the realms of sports or the arts? These people were active abolitionists, 5 black women, 5 black men, 5 white women, and 5 white men who were doing exactly what you just were describing going on in 1960s in Mississippi and in Louisiana and Georgia in the South. These people were fighting the good fight, and they inspire me to this day. And I'm doing it because I want young people especially to see that this has been going on for centuries and that black and white people join forces to overcome this plague that was on our country.
You make such a strong point, because I think that one of the things that you've said, something which I have to go back to, is I hear in what you're saying that you were at a point where you were able to communicate these ideas. So you had to have a structure around you that allowed you to say, yes, I am able to communicate these ideas because I think they're important, right? And this is not now. This is, this is historical. So I think it's important to communicate that they have always been allies.
And co-conspirators and all that.
Right. They have always been allies, co-conspirators, because I think in this conversation about racial equity and reconciliation, one of the more important parts is talking about the fact that there have been some people with power who have actually played a role of being, like you say, co-conspirators, right? Of being allies, of being people that were willing to push the agenda because they knew that, and even they were in a structure that didn't necessarily support them, but they knew it was important enough that those voices needed to be heard. And that's why I think the historical context that you bring to this equation is very important, because it shows that they have been Caucasian men and women who have been part of this dialogue for decades and for centuries. I was explaining to somebody when they were talking, I said I was doing a historical study on how things like during slavery, how certain laws were initiated, right? So there were times when they realized that indentured servants and slaves would run away together.
Yep, it's in the book.
Exactly, would run away. Please, you go ahead and expand on it, because I'm probably going to generalize it. But
no, you're exactly right. You're exactly right. And they
would
made
run
the law
away together. A law had to be enacted to make it that, we got to stop that, because you had, white folk and black folk running away together because they knew that, we're all slaves. But what they basically did was to say, Now we have to enact a law that says if you run away with a slave and we catch you, then you're no longer an indentured servant. You're going to be a slave. You know what I mean? You're going to be just like everybody. And it's not like you get this 7 years and then you're going to get a piece of land. You're going to be an indentured servant for the rest of your life.
Well, they did carrots and sticks. That was the stick. The carrot was, we're going to have it be really different for Black people. They can be whipped way worse than you can. They really tried to make that separation in those laws so those two forces didn't join to overthrow the power.
Exactly.
They knew that was the recipe would be divide and conquer and make Black people inferior. So as soon as a white person could feel a little bit better than somebody, they felt advantaged, privileged, etc. And the legacy speaks for itself 400 years later. But yes, exactly right. So let me see if I can slip into the conscious masculinity that built on this for me, because I was seeing these things as being no-brainers, that the toothpaste was out of the tube for me. I couldn't go backwards because I saw the ways in which these oppressions were all linked, all joined together. There was not any distinction in my mind other than some of the ways in which it was being played out. So the way in which masculinity, conscious masculinity, kept coming up for me started with that men's group. The next thing that happened was, and actually this was characteristic of the racial awareness too. I started reading other people's thoughts and writing. And for me in the 60s, it was everything from Invisible Man and Native Son and Soul on Ice. These books made indelible impressions. And then I started reading first feminist pieces by, the Betty Friedan and some of the more Gloria Steinem's work. Gloria Steinem's quoted at great length in this book about men's and women's groups, because she sets an agenda for men to be pursuing going forward. But then I started reading a book by a woman named Dorothy Dinnerstein called The Mermaid and the Minotaur. And the quote that I take from that book that's been a hallmark of my life is, "Until men nurture children, there will always be war." And for me, that is of deep, profound essence of truth, because it's really saying men have to develop a heart connection to their spouses and their children if there's going to be a way to prevent violence, the violence that is embodied in war. So that's what I started working towards in my teaching career, trying to be, first of all, a role model. Second of all, encouraging men to enter the profession at all early ages of children. And eventually it became my calling card and a pursuit in the actual teaching.
Right.
And so for weeks on end, I would do a unit with my sixth graders called Human Growth and Change. And in that unit, there'd be weeks of alone time with the boys and me, teaching them conscious masculinity. I would start out our time together by showing them a picture of a pregnant man, a man wearing the empathy belly. And numerous years I'd get one and put it on. And I'd say to them, "Why do you think I'm doing this? Why would I take your good time and mine and show you what it looks like, what it feels like to be pregnant?" And the whole thing was predicated on teaching them that girls and women richly and totally deserve their respect, their admiration, their esteem, to try to undo what I actually saw today on The Daily Show. You maybe heard what happened in England a couple of weeks ago when a woman was raped and murdered by a policeman.
Yes.
And then there was a huge protest and the police came and violently. Well, Trevor Noah on The Daily Show had a whole segment this morning on the responsibility that men have to prevent violence against women. And that was really the underpinning of what I was doing with those sixth graders. I developed back in the late 70s, early 80s, this concept that's now widespread relevant of consent. I said, you don't ever assume anything about how a girl or young woman feels. You always have to be talking and checking out and communicating. So it was all this making it conscious for 11 and 12-year-olds.
Right. Right.
And that became a centerpiece of my teaching year.
Right. Because I think, I mean, yeah, like bells are going off in my head, because one of the things that I talk about is this thing that we as men have never been enculturated to know anybody else's perspective. And
white men in particular.
Exactly. And and I'm going to let you say that, because I think, that's the beauty that you bring to the dialogue, that I think you are able, and many of the people that I speak to are able to take it from, because you already have this male dominant thought process or thought level. And then you also have this white male level, which is we own everything and we are the originators of anything, and, boo-hoo to everybody else. You understand? So I think that on a normal level, a male dominant society is sick, period, right? On an even scarier level, a male-dominated Caucasian viewpoint-based worldview raises that threat level, because not to say that, I'm talking to you, you're a brother, I can tell your heart, right? As a man, right? It just so happens that you're a Caucasian man, but the fact that you're aware, you're aware of it, is this blessing to the dialogue. But that's not the commonality. You know what I'm saying? That's not the common perspective. So you and I are in this place where we're not only fighting with this, hey, you've got to be a conscious male. You have also created this thing of saying, or not created, but engage this level of, we also have to be conscious of the fact that there's this other level of maleness, which has to do with kind of this Caucasian male worldview of thinking that, we own everything and we dominate everything and we don't have to care about anybody else and that kind of thing. So I think the way that you're articulating it is just making my mind go ping, ping, ping. So.
But I would add one more piece.
Go ahead.
The heterosexism.
Yes. Yes.
Please
go ahead and
another big part of the thrust of my work with the 10 and 11-year-olds, and in my family and other places where I operate, has been to undo homophobia.
Yes.
So I taught sexual identity, gender identity to these 10 and 11-year-olds. I brought in people from Smith College, women who represented the whole rainbow of sexual orientations and gender identities, to affirm those individuals who are also having been marginalized historically. It's another, for me, no-brainer, toothpaste out of the tube. It's a group that deserves full recognition and equality, and still not getting it. The Equality Act is stuck in the Senate, where Mitch McConnell has let everything die. And I've gone up against family members who have been in opposition to it, but it was another underpinning, a centerpiece of this unit called Human Growth and Change.
Right.
And it's also been something I've crusaded on behalf of, with starting back when they had the first Pride March in Northampton, and I wasn't allowed to bring the banner of my school because there were people in the school who were uncomfortable being identified with a Pride March.
Right.
Miraculously, 40 years later, my last year, the school fully embraced the Pride March, which I'd been going to for 39 years,
Right.
asked me if I wanted to become the Grand Marshal because I'd been fighting for it. And I said, no, just make a float, get it out there, and I'll march behind it. And that was my last year, 4 years ago, was we finally got the school to see it as not only okay, but worthy of celebrating.
Congratulations.
These kind of efforts are never over. That's how it feels.
No, they're not.
Yeah.
And the thing is that even for me, who is comes from a society that is very Judeo-Christian, right? I already fight this argument of one of the things I was talking about last week was that this is inherited religion, religion. And in Africa, we are very homophobic.
I know.
It is an extremely homophobic environment, right? And we're raised that way. We're raised with this level of homophobia that is just so prime. That's why you've seen like Uganda, the laws in Uganda and all this kind of stuff. And for me, who was raised like a Christian kid, and when I have these conversations as a Christian, people look at me and go, well, how can you have that? How can you be open like that when you claim you're Christian? I'm like, listen, I'm not God. I have always said I'm not God. And the way I look at the savannah and wildebeest and hyenas and warthogs and the abundance and the ability of whatever spiritual higher power, right, you are viewing to create this diversity and these different innate behaviors and interactions and symbiosis, beings that rely on other beings to live and who are you to decide how another human being shows up? You know what I mean?
Oh, I so know what you mean, because I've tried for probably over 15 years now to engage in an email dialogue with my born again, fundamentalist, evangelical brother-in-law on all the subjects we've just been touching on, and others like climate change, and he uses the Bible, which he believes is his absolute truth, to make the case virtually against almost everything I stand for. There was a program today, a clip of people at the Robert E. Lee High School in maybe Georgia. And they showed people defending the name Staying. He was the Civil War general.
Right. Robert E. Lee.
And they wanted to keep the name of the school, and they used arguments like the Bible told slaves to obey their masters. I mean, so that Bible, we know, can be used as a tremendous weapon. And I think the countries you're talking about in Africa, and this, let's not forget, these same laws, sodomy laws, have been on the books in this country and in England, and people have been
Western civilization based off the Bible. Makes sense.
Well, and also in Islam, which is based on the Bible too. The culture that was the most accepting cultures. I don't know enough about African cultures before white people got there, but Native American cultures have enormous embracing of what you just were doing about all the beasts and the variety and they were accepting trans members of their community, people who had different gender identities. They were not ostracized and vilified and killed. They embraced them, and I think I think we have infinite things to have learned that we didn't learn yet from Native culture, and that's another thing we've worked to undermine and destroy with colonial settlers.
Yeah, I'm pulling up on, because I want to make sure that I'm as close to the word as I can be, because I know that many people who are listening. I have several friends that get on here and are very Christian, just like me, but at the same time, I have always, in terms of this particular dialogue, always fallen on the there's a passage in the Bible where I can't remember who was asking Jesus about which one is the most important law. Okay, and he says, "Love your brother."
I was just going to say, "Love thy neighbor." Yep, exactly. Yep, that's the most important one, and it doesn't say unless they have. Unless they're black, unless they're gay.
That's basically it. You know what I'm saying? Love thy brother.
Yeah.
So for me,
they wrote the rest of the book. If that had been the end of the book, we'd be in so much better shape.
Exactly. Because the reality of it is that They asked, which one is the most important? That was the question. Which one is the most important one? And that was the response. So for me, I know that culturally, okay, I may not agree because I've been enculturated a certain way. Okay, I've been enculturated a certain way, and I had to get to the point where I recognized that, because I was like, when I go back and I talk about homophobia, I was raised in a homophobic place, so I was very homophobic. And I can remember my first experience with somebody who was a homosexual was in college, right, in university, and I was working in a particular place, and one of the close people that I had to work with was, he had a relationship. He was in a very close relationship. And I can remember him coming in one day, and he and his partner had been attacked in Boston Commons. Okay. Had been attacked. This is 1993. 1993, I think. Had been attacked in Boston Commons. Fortunately, they were able to think. And I remember that dialogue. And by then I had already built some credit of feelings towards this person. I had a credit account of feelings, because this was a good person. This was a person who had been nothing but magnanimous and loving and caring, and so it was humanized. It was no longer this cultural thing. But
that's where the hope comes from.
Exactly, it was humanized, and I can remember how I felt. Just imagining, like, why would somebody like hurt this person? This, and that was my transition. That was my transition point. That was my growing point. That was me learning to get out of what I had been taught for decades.
It's a great story. It embodies what all people who go through transformations need, something akin to that.
Right. Because it was like,
humanizes a person that they've always thought was less than.
Right.
And
right.
And so you have to remember when Jesus said, what's the, when Jesus was asked who or what's the most important, and he says, love thy neighbor. That's the message you were receiving in that moment.
Right.
You had all that enculturation that was operating to keep you from experiencing that. It took that compassion you felt. Right. And that makes all the difference.
Yes.
So I do want to say one more thing, at least, about this other work that I've referred to. I think I've mentioned it, where I'm participating with this wonderful Black man, James, in co-leading these workshops called Developing Healthy Boys, under the umbrella of Merge for Equality and Equity, an organization here in Western Mass. And in this capacity, we've developed curriculum that can last as long as a week, but when funding's not there, we've slenderized it down to 3 days or even often 1 day. And we're about to do a session next week remotely. We turned it into a remote experience for early childhood educators who sadly, tragically, are almost always women still, because that work of nurturing to prevent war is still not in our hearts as men enough. And I did try. I would gather men teachers for conferences when I was in the profession, just to try to reinforce and bolster each other, because it was a thankless job in the realm of financial remuneration and cultural affirmation. But now James and I are going and sitting in these rooms with, often in Stanford last year before the pandemic, 50 women, almost all of whom were women of color, and talking for 6 hours about conscious masculinity as it manifests in a classroom of 3 and 4-year-olds.
So define for our listeners and viewers, define what you mean by conscious masculinity.
Sure.
Probably. I mean, we've been talking about it for a while, and I think as
I didn't have the awareness of how much
like you and I are like talking because we kind of are in this, but for somebody who's just tuning in to be like, I keep hearing you talk about conscious masculinity. What does that even mean?
Yeah, I've been drawing these parallels to anti-racism work, anti-homophobic work. It's a consciousness, especially on the part of white men, of the fact that they are not any more privileged, given more rights or more power, even though the culture still does that, than anyone else. And as a male, as a male being conscious of the degree to which there is injustice in empowering and giving more than is deserved to men, it's been a process of dismantling, of undoing, like you had to do in that story you just told about opening up to that gay couple, undoing the damage that was done to my psyche by living and breathing in the air and water of this very struggling culture, to recognize that women have equal rights and deserve great honor and respect. Like I was saying, I did with those 10 and 11-year-olds. That's conscious masculinity, right? Showing them that man wearing that pregnancy simulator was trying to develop empathy, right, develop deep understanding, develop historical awareness of injustice. Right. These are all the underpinnings of becoming a conscious male in this society. Right. I could go on because, as you know, I'm telling you, I've written a book about this, and it's near and dear and deep into my soul and spirit. But that's what I'm referring to when I say conscious masculinity, really embracing the feminine in yourself, developing your own emotional toolbox so there's way more responses than anger, knee-jerk reactivity, really developing a great amount of willingness to be vulnerable. Right. And then using all that when you're raising your children, especially your boys, but both. I've got 4 kids. They range in age. One's going to be 30 in another month, from 30 to 50. And every one of them is a central person in my life from birth. Well, Annabelle I met when she was 2, but the other 3, I was there at their births. And now I have 4 grandchildren, and I'm trying to impart similar values of being a conscious male to them. And I certainly tried to do it in my teaching.
Thank you. I think that is very succinct. And also, you make a really great point, because I think for me, another really major turning point, when you talk about that, you were saying earlier about men raising children, or men being engaged in the nurturing of their children being the turning point. I always tell a story of how watching my first child be born was a turning point for me. And culturally, I know that a lot of the disconnect that, men in my culture have suffered from is from being excluded from that experience, because culturally we are excluded from that experience because it's taboo. It is a taboo for a man to be present in the birthing room with his wife and all this kind of stuff. So we are disconnected, and therefore we continue to live this disconnected life where we are this hunter-gatherer, provider kind of thing, and all I do is I come back to deposit and go out again to do what I need to do, as opposed to being part of the process from beginning to end. So when I became part of the process, meaning I lived with the pregnancy every single minute, and then was part of every single minute of the labor and the delivery, and got to cut the cord, it created this unbreakable bond, unbreakable nurturing bond that made me appreciate, first recognize there was a higher power, because it happened for me in that moment. And because my show covers religions and things, I will use the word higher power, but it made me recognize there was a God at the moment. Like, there's a God. I knew in that moment that from this little minuscule thing that I had done, for this being to come out going, where it was a grand design. It wasn't just something, and from that point on, I was rooted in the experience of life. And I would never be, and I knew from that moment I would never be the same. And I think that I know even in my own books, right? I have a book coming out called In the Shadow of the Mountain. I wrote poetry books, but this was a book about my own change and my own growth. I knew that that was such a key moment in my life. And I saw it for what it was, which was this this confluence of life. And for a lot of African men, where if we could do that for them, we could literally change a cultural misnomer that has existed for centuries. Because yes, we have these cultural things that have been part of the way we do things, but this is that one life experience that all men need to be engaged in. That if you are fathering a child, or you have to be part of that experience in order for you to make that change in your mind that will change the way you look at women, change the way you look at yourself, and change the way that you understand your play in this great grand design that the universe has for mankind. And spend the rest of your days getting educated about what that is, because for me, that's what happened. From that point on, I have spent my days at least not just being in this la land, but kind of really being conscious. Like when I look at my older daughter, who's 23 now, and I'm having a problem with her, and I feel a certain way about what she's saying, or I go back to that moment. I go back to that moment, and I see her for who she is. You know what I mean? I truly see her for what she is. Because I think if I wasn't connected to that moment, I could disconnect from that.
Yeah, and that's what's happened to way too many men.
Exactly.
And things were popping for me when you were talking, but I couldn't agree with you more about the essence of what you described and how that moment made you feel deep connection to life. Right. The life force, and how many, and a couple of quick things. The man I do the trainings with for developing healthy boys, he works with another man who was one of the founders of the Men's Resource Center in Amherst, and the two of them turned their the national merge here in the States. They called it Merge. I think it was called Merge International or Merge Incorporated, whatever. And they went to Africa, and they started doing the kinds of workshops that you heard me describe with developing healthy boys for African boys and men. They've been to several countries in Africa, trying to, in many ways, both bolster these conscious masculinities and, as you've described with your discussion about homophobia, undo some of the damage and the harm to the psyches of these African boys and men who ended up really coming around. I mean, I wish they didn't have to stop the work. It ended up, the finances didn't continue, whatever, but I've heard stories about the impact that work had on these people in these cultures who were ripe for change. Lots of it was about stopping the domestic violence, stopping men feeling like they were entitled to be violent against women, because that was in the culture too. So that was one big thought I had when you were describing what you did about, and then the other one was, I gave myself a big gift back starting when I told you about that job at White Plains Urban Renewal Agency. Mm-hmm. I started keeping a journal. And I've got 41 books. And when I retired, I said to myself, you can now read those. And you can listen.
Wow, you went back and you were reading your journals.
I'm up to book number 35.
Wow.
And in those journals are the descriptions of the birth of my children. That I get to relive. You have it embedded in your memory in a beautiful way. Just listening to your description was so evocative for me of what you went through, memories of my own. And I have it also now written down so I can kind of relive it. Joni Mitchell, one of my favorite singers, has a song called The Circle Game. Don't know if you've ever heard it, but she says, you can't go back. you can only look behind. And that's what I'm doing with these journals. And it's the trajectory of my whole life as becoming more anti-racist, becoming more conscious of masculinity. And so I'm having this incredible reliving experience because of the gift. I didn't think about it when I was doing it. I just thought, I want to get these feelings out. I want to capture this moment. But now, as I retired, I said that when I retired 4 years ago. It took me till 2 months ago to start reading. But now I'm fully immersed in it and getting to live the moment in which we live and the past. And one last thing that I want to mention is when you were describing being there for the birth as being so essential and pivotal, I wrote an article for an incredible publication that emerged from the Men's Resource Center called Voice Mail. It's a magazine edited and often with writings by Rob Oken, who turned many of the pieces into a book called Voice Mail. And one of the pieces I wrote, and I've done several, was called Showering Together. And it was all about the importance of men prenatally showing up at baby showers to start bonding with their unborn baby before the birth.
Yes.
So just to accentuate the magical moment you were capturing, even going back a little bit further and saying, no, don't have that just be women's world. That's where you can start showing up and also exhibiting the humility, the humbleness of entering a world that men traditionally have not been part of and therefore don't know as well as they might and need to learn and listen and pay attention.
Yes, yes. Because I think that one of the things I think culturally we across the world, we as human beings have failed to embrace is the understanding that we have to evolve. We are an evolving species. And as technology allows us to do 3D images of the baby, as technology allows us to figure out what sex the baby is going to be. Yeah, you can decide whether you want to know that or you don't want to know that. But the reality of that is that it is in human, 100 years from now, we are going to be way more sophisticated as human beings than we are now. And I've always talked about it. It may seem weird to people, but I tell them, I said, it is human search for God that is part of this evolution. We are, some of us grew up before microwaves. We were born in the age before microwaves. And then we became then you have the microwave age. We were people who were born before cell phones, but you also have people who were born before cars, before motorized engines, wagons and horse. So if you kind of start to actually think about humanity going back and back, you begin to realize there was a time when we were walking around probably in loincloths with the sticks in our hands. And that's part of it. But that evolution is that's our history. That's our story.
Yeah, and that's what
that is part of our story.
I feel like that's what I'm being able to see in these journals, my own interpersonal evolution as a being.
Exactly.
And that's part of what I feel like I can, it's humbling because I've made a trajectory that had parts of it that were not who I am now, who I wanted to be maybe. And I wanted to say a word or two because I'm guessing we're going to get out of time soon.
Yes, we are like close to time, but it's been great.
I just want to say a word or two about this men's group that I'm in.
Yes.
The group that I'm in now started in 1978. And in the book that I wrote about it, I have the actual copy of the initial letter that someone put on some, posters, places where you put posters to get people to want to come to the first meeting. I was not in it. I'm the new kid on the block, and this is my 32nd year. And this group has been such a force in my life. I just want to give one example and to try to encourage listeners to find a way to obviously buy my book so you know what to do to get a men's group started, but also to be in groups like this, which I think Comega is one of. It's not meeting every month, but same spirit. one of the main moments that I write about in the book is after my son was born, my youngest, who's going to be 30, he was born with a birth defect called hydrocephalus. It's when
What
your
is that?
brain doesn't drain spinal fluid.
Okay.
It can cause water on the brain, maybe you've heard. Your head can get, and then it can cause you to die. So he had to have many brain operations for the first months of his life. It was very, very, very stressful for my wife, my 3-year-old at the time daughter, and myself. And I had my men's group. There was no way I could exhibit the serious vulnerability I was feeling when my wife, who had just had a baby, wanted to nurse that baby, wanted to be there for I could not show too much of my needs because she had such great needs that I needed to take care of as best I could. So I would go to my men's group. And one of the times I went, they said, we want to help you heal from this. And they had me lie down, and 8 of them gave me a massage for like an hour. And I just cried. I cried for the whole time because I'd been holding it all in. All that pain and sadness that I was feeling from my wife, obviously for this infant that had just been born who was crying in pain all the time from this pressure on his brain. To me, it's a graphic example of how you can find people who want to be there for you and support you in your moments of need. And that's what these groups have done. That's what the book's about.
Yes. Thank you so much. And I think that what you're saying about that is the beauty for me of Comega. And I think I've shared that because for me, that was my first experience of that. My first experience of men allowing me to be vulnerable without judgment.
Yeah.
And not holding me. I had never experienced that in my life. And it was my first weekend at Comega was like life-changing because I saw, and even though I was more a spectator because I was being introduced into stuff and it was so uncomfortable for me to see men, but I watched something like that where we had one person, and I have to be, fortunately I'm not mentioning names, but there was a person who had a need. And there was a question set out to say, what do you need? And that person said, I just need to be held.
Yeah.
And the person went down on the floor and circle of 8 men went around this, 7 men, because it's circle of 8, 7 men went around this person and did what you just said, which is just 7 men, just holding and stroking somebody who just asked for what they needed at that time. And for me, just the idea that a man could ask to be held.
That's conscious masculinity.
Exactly. It was just like, up to today, it just blew my mind.
Yeah.
Now that
it would blow the minds of most of the men on this planet still.
Exactly. Now that I've been doing it for many years, for me, it's normal. If I was in a place, it'd be very uncomfortable for another man. But for me, if a man asked me for a hug, I'd be like, not a problem.
My men's group met last Sunday and we're so frustrated because of the pandemic. We gave back hugs.
Yeah.
Back to back hugging.
Yeah.
Because people,
like I said, looking from the outside looking in, we seem like crazy men. Yeah. We sound like crazy men. From the inside looking out, we are men who would die with our hearts.
Yeah.
And there was a point in my life where that became so important for me that nothing else mattered. And for now, nothing else matters to me but the fact that I show up more heart than brain, more heart than mind.
Yeah. And
I want to thank you so much, Tom, because we've got so much more years. You are welcome here anytime. We're going to keep talking. I mean, you have I love what you brought to the table.
Thank you.
Just some amazingly poignant, helpful, life-feeding, nurturing root stuff, and please don't shy from my invitations, but we will be talking again. We are now, it felt like we've been talking for 30 minutes. I think there's so much more we can touch on. Hopefully we've covered a lot of the work that you're doing, the books that you're doing, but please make sure you send them to me so that I can provide them as resources for our listeners and our viewers.
Okay.
But, I'll leave the last word to you and, we'll go from there.
No, I want to affirm you, Sonica. I want to say that from the minute I met you on the Zoom cross-race dialogue group, and you spoke from the heart about feelings you were having regarding the January 6th events, I felt a bond starting with you. And then when I heard that you were doing a show like this, of course I wanted to participate, but I feel honored
Thank you.
to be included and to be part of what you're creating.
Thank
So
you.
thank you from the bottom of my heart for allowing me to have this opportunity to share my life and to hear about yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, you know, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining the Wholehearted Men Show. As I always say, you know, all we try to do is bring this new man that we are trying to inform into your computers, your living rooms, your hearts, your homes, and hopefully the people that we're bringing are at least speaking to you from a perspective that will help you grow. So thank you so much, Tom. Appreciate your time and look forward to speaking with you again.
Thank you, Sonica.